Okay, so for people who've just joined, we'll be having a Q&A session at the end. So please prepare any questions and send them over to me and I'll ask them at the end of our session today. And now to introduce our eminent guest is John from the Edinburgh branch. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Carrie. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome, a very warm welcome on a very wild day, the sort that blows the branches off trees. We're delighted to have a new facilitator from whom you've just heard, Carrie Alderton, today with us, supporting the Saltire team of Sarah, Katria and Heather in the management of today's event. So for today, a couple of years ago, our guest speaker, James Ogilvie, and I were sat together at a fete when he came across and said to me the words that any talks organizer absolutely longs to hear. What he said was that if I ever was looking for a speaker, he could oblige. And he certainly has done so. For a year ago, he gave a talk for me in another context about conquering the highest summit on each continent of the earth. For James is possibly the only Seven-Summitteer that any of us is likely to meet. Stirring stuff indeed. Today's subject, I have to say, of course, is a little more down to earth, but we'll show that James is a man who can see the wood for the trees. That's the end of my cliches, by the way. For as a former senior staff member of the Edinburgh-based Forestry Commission and now a trustee of the Woodland Trust, who is better placed to tell us about the fascinating history of the Forestry Commission in Britain? Over to you, James.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you for that introduction, I think. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Hopefully. Good, good. Yes, so as John mentioned, I spent my career in forestry. I worked for the Forestry Commission for 40 years. I'm living the retirement dream now, and I'm a non-exec director of the Woodland Trust and the Borders Forest Trust. I'm a business ambassador for Tree Aid, and also proud to be a non-exec director at an estate in the Highlands of Scotland called Carrara, which will come into this presentation actually. So, sorry, I just want to really start by asking you, when you hear the words Forestry Commission, what do you think of? So kind of hold that thought, because I'm going to come back to that question at the end of my presentation. So this is really about commemorating 100 years of the Forestry Commission. The emphasis will be on Scotland. That's where I spent most of my time with the Commission, and the Commission's rise and fall and its eventual devolutionary demise, as it were. Not many government institutions have survived 100 years. I mean, the Treasury springs to mind, Ministry of Defence, but I'd be hard put to think of others, and that makes the Forestry Commission pretty special. It was nearly killed off on several occasions, but in the end it proved to be one of the best inventions that the British government has ever made. So let's start at the beginning. By 1918, tree cover in the UK was a pretty derisory 5%. That made it one of the lowest of any European countries. And of course, during World War I, we suffered greatly from the depredations of U-boat attacks on convoys. And in fact, timber shortage was a particular issue during the First World War. And Prime Minister Lloyd George famously remarked that Britain came closer to losing the war through lack of timber than want of food. So this was a pretty major upset that we had. And after the war, a committee was formed, the Auckland Committee, to advise on how best to conserve and develop the UK's forests. And its secretary was the influential father of British forestry, so-called, Roy Robinson. This is him in the slide here. Roy Robinson of His Majesty's Office of Woods. And this chap would come to make a very significant and unique contribution to forestry in Britain. So the Auckland Committee concluded that what we needed was over 1.7 million acres of conifers over an 80-year period. And this was to be led by a government body, the Forestry Commission. So the Forestry Commission was duly set up in 1919, just at the end of the year, actually. And two key players in this were this chap on the left, Lord Lovat, and this is Lord Clinton. Now, Lord Lovat was from Scotland, Lord Clinton was from England, and Lord Lovat was a bit of a gambler, actually, and he liked a bet. History doesn't relate how much money changed hands on this bet, but what they did was they bet to see who could reach home soonest and plant the Commission's very first trees. And this was after the first meeting of the Forestry Commissioners on the 7th of December 1919. So Lord Clinton, this chap here with his dog, he travelled to Devon, and Lord Lovat had the longer journey to North Scotland. And when Lord Clinton arrived at the station, local foresters escorted him to a nearby forest, Eggersford Forest, where he planted some beech and larch trees. And then Lord Lovat alighted from the train at Elvin to hear the disappointing news that he'd been pipped to the post and England had beat Scotland. I think if it had been now with flights, COVID permitting, of course, Lord Clinton would definitely have won the bet. But there we are. And so the commission were formed, and this plaque commemorates the planting of the first trees by Lord Clinton. And if you look at the bottom very carefully, you can see the words the Forestry Commission at the United Kingdom. So in fact, briefly, it was a UK body until 1922, when Ireland seceded from the UK under the Anglo-Irish Treaty. So let's move on now to the Roaring Twenties. Well, it started with an economic crisis, and this was the first near miss, in fact, for the Forestry Commission in 1920. The government formed a committee called the Geddes Committee, and they recommended scrapping the Forestry Commission. They cut staff, they cut forestry schools, but the show did in fact go on. And then government policy reversed. They realized that property prices were rock bottom, and they went on an acquisition spree. And in 1923, they added the Crown Woods, and that includes the oxymoron New Forest, the New Forest being one of the oldest forests in the country, and the Forest of Dean. And so in this way, only 15 years after its formation, the Forestry Commission owned or managed about 40% of the area which is currently managed by the respective state forestry bodies in the three countries. And by 1939, 20 years after its formation, the Forestry Commission was the largest landowner in Britain. So quite a meteoric kind of land acquisition from its early days. We then enter the depressing 30s, and in fact, the next near miss was in 1931 with the Great Depression, another huge economic crisis. The commission was nearly scrapped. It was put on a care and maintenance basis. This chap plays a very important role. This is John Sterling Maxwell, who was the third chair of the Forestry Commission. He was a founding member of the National Trust for Scotland, and he owned Carrara Estate up at Rannoch, and he did some pioneering trials with different species, which showed that, in fact, Sitka spruce was the preeminent species of choice in the uplands in this country. It grew very quickly. He was a really interesting guy. I mean, I think there's probably a presentation to be had on him. I looked up Wiki, and John Sterling Maxwell realized the importance of green spaces within the city, and he was determined to protect the Pollock Estate in Glasgow. And he gave it to the people of Glasgow full access in 1911. So he was very enlightened and ahead of his time. But the big problem was attracting workers to work in rural Britain. And Sterling Maxwell said the planting of forest workers on the land is a more anxious and much more expensive business than the planting of trees. So that was definitely a bit of an issue. Now then, I've got a question for you. There won't be a prize for the correct answer, but the question is, what came first, forest parks or national parks in Britain? And the answer simply is forest parks, because Argyll Forest Park started as way back as 1936, and Galloway came along in 1947. Now, we didn't have national parks in Scotland until 2002, which was Loch Lomond and Trossachs, 2003, which was Cairngorms. In England, they were ahead of the game, and they created national parks in the 1950s. But of course, Scotland trumps everything by inventing an amazing guy called John Muir, who you probably heard of. And he founded the whole US national park system back in the 1890s, so a long time ago. So that's another story. But anyway, forest parks became a bit of a thing. And gradually people were visiting the wider countryside. Then we come to what are called the Warring Forties. I found this rather nice slide. Businesses could sponsor a Spitfire if they clubbed together. I don't know what the minimum figure was to get your business's name on the side. So here was the Forestry Commission Spitfire. There's a story about that as well, which I could say, but I don't have enough time just now. So by the start of World War II, 1939, Commission forests were only 20 years old at the oldest. So they weren't old enough to make a meaningful contribution to the war effort. So in fact, 90% of timber for the war effort came from private estates. A lot of the work, of course, was by hand, by axes and saws and horses, and forest workers increased from about 14,000 to over 44,000, and many of these workers came from Commonwealth countries. And of course, the lumberjills were famous as making a big contribution. And this is an amazing thing here, because can you imagine this today? But by the end of the war, almost all conifer plantations between 20 and 30 years old had been felled. That was a third of the country's timber resources. Just beggars belief, you know, to think about what the visual impact of that would have been on the countryside at the time. Anyway, soldiers were demobilized after the war, and the forestry training schools were formed, including Glen Tress. And then this one here, which is Ben Moor, perhaps the most famous one in Argyll. So in 3 decades, the Commission had transformed itself from a small band of enthusiasts into a sophisticated government department managing a estate of more than 600,000 hectares. Research knowledge was increasing, forest management was vibrant, and expansion was impressive. But the real boom times were just around the corner in what I've called here the expanding 50s. So by 1950, the Forestry Commission was felling and extracting something over 320,000 cubic meters a year. Now, just to put that into context, one forest alone, which is Kielder, which is actually the largest man-made forest in Northern Europe, but that produces more than that every year just within Kielder. But still, it was a significant figure. And planting averaged 10,000 hectares a year, and it was focused on upland sites. And you can see some of the very early ground preparation machines here, which were tractor crawlers with huge plows behind. In 1942, Lord Robinson, you remember the father of British forestry, died. And the following year, there was a devastating storm which caused a massive amount of wind blow. It was about 1.2 million cubic meters. So many times the annual removal of trees through felling. But the world was changing. By the way, I do like the slide. I think he's posed for this because extracting wind-blown timber must have been an absolute nightmare in the days before mechanization, but it seems hard to believe that this is how it was done. However, men were men in those days. But the world was changing, and the original case for the Forestry Commission, if you remember, which was a strategic reserve of timber following the U-boat depredations, that kind of changed, you know, with atomic energy and atomic warfare and that kind of thing. So, and global trade increasing. However, the case for forestry in terms of the economic and social agendas, this is to say, timber production and employment, was definitely increasing. The Forestry Commission built many properties. By 1958, they owned 4,600 properties, many forest houses, and they built several purpose-built villages to overcome the problem that John Sterling Maxwell had identified of how to get people into rural areas to do the work. And of course, they couldn't commute in the way that we can today because car ownership wasn't really a thing. However, come the 60s, this was in fact becoming continued boom time. There was expansion both by the Forestry Commission and by the private sector. And timber production nearly doubled in the 1960s from something like 700 cubic meters to over 1,300 by the end of the decade. That's a lot, but it's still only a tenth of what we produce today from our forests. And private forestry was increasing at this time as well, having had been in the doldrums for many years. I mean, many of the big estates were broken up after the war. During the 60s, private forests accounted for something like 40% of the total planting. And there was a scheme called the Dedication Scheme, very famous at its time. And that, together with an approved wood scheme, totaled almost 1 million hectares from the private side. In Scotland, pulp mills were constructed here at Fort William, at Corpach, and chipboard mills were also constructed at Inverness, Annan, and Irvine, and these created thousands of jobs. And this also was the time when the first wave of mechanization started. So the early use of crosscut saws and axes and horses gave way to chainsaws and tractors. This is, I say it's the first wave because this relied on winches and so on. It wasn't the hydraulics that created the sort of second wave of mechanization, which we'll come to. But the helicopters were used in special situations for spraying insecticides, aerial insecticides, and more generally for applying fertilizer to young plantations, neither of which really happens these days. So you can see these early huge machines. I mean, this one here was an import from Canada, more used to the sort of scale of forestry over there than the rather smaller scale stuff in this country. And the very early harvesters and forwarders. However, society was changing a lot in the 60s, and there was a big increase in TV ownership, car ownership, and programs about the outdoors led to a greater public awareness of Britain's countryside. By the end of the 1960s, something like 15 million visits each year were made to Forestry Commission forests. So the Commission was changing very rapidly into sort of social benefits. If I tell you that in 2016 they did a census and realized that there were only 10 million visits to Forestry Commission forests, the 15 million back in the 60s was really very big indeed. However, the public didn't always like what they saw, and there was a growing reaction against large-scale uniform industrial softwood plantations. Despite the public being given a right to roam in Commission forests, what happened was that the Commission was becoming increasingly out of step with public opinion. Now, things started to change in 1963. There was a government review which concluded, the Commission will bear in mind the need to provide public access and recreation and will devote more attention to increasing the beauty of the landscape. Interesting, this word beauty, because that was incorporated into the Wildlife and Countryside Act. However, it's sort of rather fallen out of fashion, but I see it's come back in a recent act, which I think is a step forward. So this 1963 government review gave the Commission a planting target of 100,000 hectares over the decade, concentrating on the uplands, particularly in Scotland, for social and employment benefits. So you can see that even in the 60s, there was no government rhetoric or narrative around environmental benefits. It was all about social and economic benefits. So we had the Forestry Act in 1967, which remained in place for many years, and 1968 was the Countryside Act. So things were changing. This is the 1963 government review. So I'm rattling through this now, but we get on to the role-changing 70s. And this was the third near miss for the Forestry Commission, because in 1972, the Treasury did a cost-benefit analysis, and they concluded that state forests were uneconomic compared with other public sector investments, and they required a target rate of return for afforestation of 3%. That's quite difficult to achieve from zero, because you have to buy the land, plant it, wait for many years before you get your revenue from it. And actually, it's very difficult to make that rate of return. But nevertheless, commission planting did continue, especially in Scotland, and it averaged about 22,000 hectares a year, which is actually pretty significant. Finally, though, people were waking up to the importance of the environmental side and the aesthetics of forestry as well, the importance of broadleaves and the landscape. And one of the most important appointments the Commission ever made was this lady here, Dame Sylvia Crowe. She was the first landscape design expert, and her legacy continues today. And it continues through things like forest design plans, which back in the day, as this old map shows, were done by hand, but now it's all CAD, computer-aided design, and you can look at the forest from any angle, including the air, and make sure that the way you design it with open space and different species is sympathetic to the landform. That's been a real game changer over recent years. But back then, this was all new stuff, and old school foresters were very askance about anything that wasn't straight lines and Sitka spruce. However, recreation continued to sort of drive this pressure on the Commission, and Forest Cabins branch was formed during the 70s. One of the big things that happened, of course, for those of us who remember it, was the 1976 drought, and then of course Dutch elm that swept through the country. However, 60 years after it was born, so to speak, the Commission had come a long way. But Britain still had a very low cover, woodland cover, compared with European countries. You know, the average in Europe is somewhere around 30%. We were still only less than a third of that. And the import bill in 1979 was 2.8 billion for timber and timber products. So the case for more state forests was as strong as ever. Ironically, and we come now into the challenge, what I call the challenging, changing 80s. Ironically, we did actually export, and we do export a little bit of timber from time to time. This is roundwood for Scandinavia, coming out of, I think it's Fort William, somebody could correct me. However, our exports are very minor compared with our imports. Of course, the 80s was most famous for Thatcherism. There was a change in the 1967 Forestry Act that enabled the Commission to sell its woodlands, and actually it sold off quite a lot in the next decade or two, about 73,000 hectares. We'll come on to this slide in a second, but the Wildlife and Countryside Act in 1981, and then a broadleaves policy in 1985 meant that the Commission's environmental agenda was finally increasing. But the big bugbear in the 80s was, you know, tax relief. So you could offset income tax against woodland creation, and that led to all sorts of consequentials. the wrong trees being planted in the wrong places. And of course, the flow country went down in history and still remains in people's memories as the kind of worst part of all that. And no forestry presentation would be complete without a picture of a bogged tractor. So here you are. Clearly what was happening was that these peat sites were being pushed to the limit, literally, with tractors disappearing and things. And of course, nobody knew then about how important our peatland reserve is from the carbon point of view, carbon capture point of view, and storage particularly, because climate change wasn't a thing. Would we could but turn the clock back now? I would say that things have moved on greatly, though, and in fact, you banning on deep peats, so that's to say anything more than 50 centimeters of peat is in fact is banned, and that 50 centimeters looks like decreasing as time goes on. However, in 1988, the tax reliefs were abolished and planting dropped like a stone. We'll see that in a second. Somebody I knew in the Forestry Commission, a guy called Bob Jones, reinvented the old crown logo, which was kind of sort of very kind of government-orientated crown, which served the commission for many years. But he came up with this logo, which I think is the best rural brand ever created in this country. Sadly lost in Wales and Scotland now, I shall say in a minute. So lots of mistakes being made for a while in the 80s, but times were changing, and as we went into the multi-purpose 90s, forestry became more about multi-benefit, and it became about restructuring. This is where the initial plantations were redesigned more sympathetically. They were made more diverse. There were open spaces introduced, and effectively you kind of, instead of, you change this carpet of spruce into a sort of patchwork quilt. Excuse me. So another thing that happened in the 1990s was introducing indicative forestry strategies. These were local authority documents that mapped the areas within their bailiwick and came up with 3 categories generally for forestry: expansion, sensitive, and acceptable, and definitely not acceptable areas. So that helped to divert people who were thinking about planting towards the right places. And we also had social benefits recognized in things like health, learning, and community through such inventions as the Central Scotland Forest. As you can see, the logo here, that changed into the Central Scotland Green Network, which became one of Scottish Government's national planning framework priorities. Design plans were introduced to aid restructuring, as in here. And production increased, timber production from 4 million cubic meters to 5 by the end of the decade. That's about half of what's being produced now, very significant. So near miss number 4 was in 1993, when potential privatization was mooted by the government. This was the whole era of Thatcherism and privatization, and the commission came under the crosshairs of the government's guns. But there were protests, funnily enough, from conservation groups. So having been definitely against the commission, conservation groups rallied to the commission's defense and said, no, we don't think you should privatize. The commission's doing good work in improving its environmental record, and we don't think the private sector would do such a good job. And what happened then is the UK Forestry Standard came along in 1998. And this was allied to independent certification and the UK Woodland Assurance Scheme. And the UK Forestry Standard covered the whole gamut of environmental, economic and social aspects of forestry in terms of what was acceptable and what wasn't acceptable. So finally there was a kind of standard for people to adhere to in terms of creating new woodlands and also replanting existing woodlands where they had been felled. So we're leaving the 20th century behind and coming now into the 21st. This slide shows new tree planting again, just in Scotland. And I'm afraid it only goes back to 1971, not back to 1919, because the data is a bit sketchy but before here. However, what you can see is that, you know, back at that time, we were planting over 30,000 hectares a year. That's huge. And we had the 1988 change in tax relief and it plummeted. It still kept kind of trickling on until the beginning of the century, where it sort of was right down in the kind of 5,000, certainly less than 10,000 hectares a year. It's gradually been creeping up since, and although the current target then was 10,000, it's now 12. And 12,000 was reached, I think, last year. I've been retired for 3 years now, so I'm slightly out of the loop. But I think, in fact, things have been increasing in Scotland, and that's good in many ways. It certainly compares very well with England, who've done next to nothing, and Wales too. But it's a long way off what was happening back, if you see, in the 70s and also the 60s beforehand. So just to say that in the last election, there was a lot of virtue signaling by all the parties as to how many trees they were going to plant. And it sort of became a race to the top. And whilst that's not likely to happen, it's brilliant now that trees have become recognized for the importance that they have, even if it's to do with climate change, which of course is massively important now, but wasn't recognized at the time. So by the start of this century, Britain's forest cover was about 12%. That's a big increase on the 5% tree cover 9 decades earlier. And a lot of that was down to Forestry Commission, and the Forestry Commission providing grants to the private sector. In Scotland, we were up to 16%, so even better. And Britain's forests were producing about 10 million tons of timber by the end of the decade, obviously mainly softwood. We had world-class processing facilities, with forestry accounting for around 35,000 jobs, but imports still accounting for about 4/5 of our demand. The social agenda was increasing, and then we had devolution, and devolution brought with it its own country strategies. Here's the Scottish forestry strategy, and there were similar ones for England and Wales as well. I don't need to remind anyone listening here that 2008 was a horrendous time with a financial crash, and that brought budget cuts for the Forestry Commission for several years. And the final near miss was in 2009. In Scotland, this was when there was a legal change enabled for the Forestry Commission forests to be leased to private companies for 75 years. Now, that never actually happened in the event. This was in Scotland only, but it could have been a very different world had that been allowed to happen. Sorry, if I said that was the final near miss, there's still one more actually to go, because in England in 2011, the Environment Secretary, this was Caroline Spellman, attempted to sell off Forestry Commission England. Now, there was an online petition. There was an online petition, and over 500,000 signatories said they did not want the commission to be sold off in England. And then there was an independent panel that showed the way forward for forestry in England. Scotland didn't have that, but we had a kind of repositioning program where of state forests could be sold and the money used for expansion elsewhere in Scotland. In 2018, there were proposals for the Forestry Commission to be merged with Scottish Government. Those proposals were very narrowly defeated by MSPs. And on the 1st of April 2019, Forestry Commission Scotland became Scottish Forestry. The reason I put this in is that Scottish Forestry is the name of the journal of the Royal Scottish Forestry Society, so they believe that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. I couldn't possibly comment. So Forestry Commission Scotland became Scottish Forestry, and Forest Enterprise Scotland, this was the land managing agency, became Forestry and Land Scotland. So these, rather than merging with Scottish Government, these became agencies of Scottish Government. And of course, we lost the FC logo, which I think is hugely regrettable, but that's progress for you, as they say. So in conclusion, Forestry Commission forests have been an extraordinary investment of taxpayers' money. A 2015 report showed that Scottish forestry contributed nearly £1 billion gross value added to Scotland's economy every year, and 771 million of that was from forestry and timber, and 183 million from forest recreation and tourism. It's really been the Commission's been one of the best investments that government has ever made. One of the longest lived investments, 100 years. But the word Forestry Commission only lives on in England now. It's been lost in Scotland and in Wales. So let's return to this question, because you've all had time to think about what those words mean to you. And, you know, I've picked up a few things here, but you could have a long list. So it's by far the largest land manager in Britain, the largest provider of outdoor recreation. Not a lot of people know that it's the largest provider of environmental art. It's hugely influential in its art, not only static art, but performance art as well. I challenge anyone on this one that I believe it's the most recognized rural brand. I haven't talked about Forest Research, which was set up some years after the Commission started, but it's been recognized as one of the preeminent research bodies of forestry research bodies in the world. It obviously literally changed the face of Britain from 5% to 13%, 100 years later. And sometimes maligned by environmentalists, often misunderstood by politicians, generally loved by the public, the Commission remains, I believe, quite simply a cherished national treasure. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, James. That was a really informative and interesting talk. I wonder, could you possibly just end your screen share? And if anybody has any questions that they'd like me...
I can't hear anything, by the way.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, Carrie, I can hear you.
You can hear me, okay. James, can you hear me all right?
James? James, can you hear us?
Sorry about this, folks, but I still can't hear anything. I'm not on mute, so I'm not sure what's going on.
I can hear you.
Okay, well, just while we sort out this tech, if anybody has any questions that they'd like us to pose to James, please put them in our Q&A box. Let me just...
Any ideas? You may have to send me a chat in the box. Okay, I'm going to disconnect my headphones and see if... Hear me?
How is that? Can you hear us now?
Ah, good.
Oh,
good,
fantastic.
Good. I hope I wasn't talking to myself for the last 3/4 of an hour.
No, we heard you perfectly. Thank you so much for that informative talk. Wonderful.
Thank
Okay,
you.
so
No, it was a pleasure.
I'll lead us over to our first question. So that was brilliant to hear a little bit more about the historical, social, environmental and economic significance of the Forestry Commission. And I think a great place to start is with our question from Joe. So Joe asks, James, how could the upcoming Glasgow International Environmental Conference, COP26, potentially impact Scotland's forestry opportunities in the future?
Yes, I'm conscious. I prepared this talk in 2019, and I'm conscious that I didn't really include enough on climate change within it, because since then, there's been a massive recognition of the importance of trees in terms of sequestering carbon. Now, that's been overplayed a bit because they're only part of the solution, they're not the whole solution. And in fact, when you look at peatlands in Scotland, they are a much more important thing in terms of the release of CO2 from degrading peatlands in Scotland is actually more than we're locking up through tree planting. So if you were to do one single thing and throw money at it, you would be actually, sorry about this, but you'd be killing deer for one thing, because they contribute to a lot to the peat situation. But you'd also spend money on restoring peatlands that have been degraded to prevent them from emitting CO2, and you would and then you reverse, they start accreting CO2 carbon gradually. But to return to the question, I think the fact that it's being held in Glasgow is hugely significant. We've got a great story to tell in terms of what Scotland has done to increase its woodland cover, and I think we need to keep that message going. However, it shouldn't be at the expense of the other aspects of forestry, the environmental and social. And I think there is quite a sort of single-mindedness at the moment. I won't say it's an obsession. I could use that word perhaps now that I'm not working for the Commission anymore, about productive forestry. It is important, but you know, a well-designed forest should include other aspects beyond just the production as well. I may not have quite got to the kernel of your question, in which case do follow it up if I've missed something.
Well, I think a very good related questions come in from Ian, which is what is the role in carbon capture
Of
the Forestry Commission, I presume?
Oh, huge. Yeah, no, absolutely huge. And of course, the thing about timber is it's truly environmentally friendly in the sense that it is sustainable for rotation after rotation. So, you know, the trees lock up carbon, you remove them through harvesting, and then you lock up. And then the main thing is to make sure that that carbon doesn't get released quickly. So, you know, the best thing is to put them into construction, which lasts for decades or centuries, and long-lived purposes. The worst thing is to kind of burn them or let them rot. However, there is a place for biomass as well. It's a big subject, but there's a place for it. So trees are very much a part of the role, and I think we've got an important story to tell. But can I just say, perhaps wearing my Woodland Trust hat, there's some interesting recent evidence to show that actually soil carbon has been very under-recognized in all of this. It's not just about trees locking up carbon, it's about what's happening in the soil, which is really, really important. And in fact, there's soils under ancient woodlands and under, you know, many of the sort of longer-lived semi-natural woodlands and so on are massively important as carbon stores. And so you think that an ancient woodland might be in equilibrium, releasing as much carbon through decay as it's absorbing, but in fact, the recent evidence shows that it's actually absorbing much more than you think. So we need all of our suite of woodlands, from ancient semi-natural right up to fast-growing conifers and so forth, to address this, help trying to reverse the impacts of CO2 emission.
And I guess the healthy ecosystems as well that come with them.
Yes, and I haven't mentioned, you know, the biodiversity crisis as well as the climate crisis. That's a whole other part of this thing. So when I talk about trees being the only environmentally friendly solution, that I really do believe that.
If I might be slightly self-indulgent, I'd love to ask you about the environmental art that you mentioned right at the end of your talk, and whether any of that has been to do with climate change.
Interesting. Well, the first kind of environmental art was done under the radar in Grisdale Forest in the Lake District by a guy called Bill. Forget his second name now, but he was well connected in the art world, and he got his art pals, some of whom have become absolutely household names now, to do their thing in the forest. Now, sometimes this was ephemeral art. More often than not, it was enduring. And my understanding, I might be wrong here, is that the powers that be came along and tutted and slapped his wrist and said he wasn't supposed to do this, and he kept doing it. And eventually, the powers that be came along and said, "This is fantastic. We want much more of this." So not just there, but in many forests, you'll see sculpture trails. We've had all sorts of things going on in Scotland with Scottish opera and theatre groups and things doing performance art. Of course, there's the whole phenomenon of pop concerts in the forest further south in Thetford and places like Bedgebury and places like that. So it's become quite a thing now and there are many forests now that have pretty significant artworks in them.
And that's wonderful. I guess as we slowly start to open up a little bit more after the pandemic, this might be one of these things that we are allowed to do. So good to know. Okay, fantastic. So a question from Gordon. The target for planting is now very low. Should it be increased?
Short answer, yes. I mean, there's some quite significant players out there, and the Woodland Trust is certainly one of them. Borders Forest Trust doing a lot as well in the borders. I mean, you can't have too many trees as far as I'm concerned. So clearly, I believe they are important. Can I just say a brief word about the urban environment? Because given that most of us, not just in this country, but in the world now, more than 50% of us live in urban environments, the quality of an urban environment is so important. It's been ignored largely, but recognized now with COVID that the quality of the places we live, the local places, is so important. And I don't believe we've given nearly enough attention to the importance of green space, blue space, and trees in particular to improve our urban environments for people's health and well-being, particularly mental health. And there's a lot of research that shows that exposure to the outdoors and green space improves people's mental health. And paying the price at the other end, because people are becoming ill and we're having to spend lots of money through the National Health Service of treating them. So I've got some quite strong views on how I believe we should make this not just a nice to have, but an absolutely essential must have. And the only way we can do this is through legislation. We've tried carrots, kind of not really working, and we need to be quite tough on new developments, not just paying lip service, but seriously improving the quality of people's lives.
And being such a green city, would you say that Edinburgh is an example of sort of best practice in this area?
We're being recorded now, aren't we? I've got to be careful what I say. Yes, there's some great work, but I don't think it's all good. And I could point to one or two examples. My belief is that nobody anywhere should live more than X distance from Y quality of Z area green space, if that makes sense. Now you can fill in the X, Y, and Z in that. But if you had that, then there would be cases where developments would not be allowed to go ahead because that compromised that requirement for people to live within 5-minute walk of good quality green space of half an acre or more, sort of thing. But there are many parts of Edinburgh that do not fulfill anything like those criteria. Strange enough, Glasgow, actually, that most people think of as not being green, is a dear green city, and there's lots of green space in Glasgow. So we're not bad, but we could do a lot better, I think.
Fantastic. Well, one more question from Joe here, I guess about how we continue some of these ideas going forwards, is James, are young people, school pupils in Scotland engaged in forestry as a field of study? How may we increase their interest and engagement in the future?
Well, and I can give you some web links, but I would point to the importance of forest school and even forest kindergarten. The Forestry Commission has been doing a lot of work with those two areas. I think there is a bit. The Girl Guides I think now has a forester's badge, which is great. So there are here and there people doing really good things with particularly young people. I think the trouble is once you get to a certain age, the curriculum is so pressured that the kind of tree-related things get forced out. And I think what children get taught is the Amazon deforestation, which of course is important to know about. But you might then pick up the idea that felling of all trees is wrong, and that wouldn't be a good thing. And unfortunately, so in other words, what I'm saying is that children at school probably know more about the Amazon forest than they do about the forests on their own doorstep. And I think that's not a great thing. You know, so it should start at home and teaching about trees and woods and forests and the importance. Now, I may be wrong because I suspect the whole climate change debate has increased awareness amongst teachers and pupils in the importance of trees. I hope I'm wrong, and I hope that is the case. But for certainly, I was quite worried that they were learning more about deforestation in the Amazon than in this country.
Very interesting. Yeah, sometimes these discussions need to start at home, I think. Yeah. One more question from David here. Any of the Forestry Commission plantations in the Scottish Islands?
Yes, there are. So they did various trials. I mean, there's quite a lot in Mull, some on Arran, and even on the Outer Isles, there's one or two bits and pieces in Lewis. I think even the odd bit in Harris. There were Scotland is a very windy country. I mean, I don't need to tell you that today, but in global terms, we were windy. So there are climatic limits on what we can do and where we can plant. And you're really at the margins in terms of the Outer Isles. And we have a grant scheme for Orkney and Shetland, and these little woodland bits that were established punched well above their size, if you like, or well above their weight. But you'll never get significant forest just because of the, it's so exposed that even the hardiest of species struggle. Some of the more inland islands, it's more of a thing. There was a period of time when they kind of worried about the costs of harvesting and extracting, and then, of course, ferrying timber off these islands, that it wasn't even going to pay for itself. However, timber prices are quite buoyant, and certainly it is economic to do so. So I wouldn't say the islands are going to ever be a big part of Scotland's forests in terms of timber, but of course, there are big environmental reasons for turning what Frank Fraser-Darling called, green deserts into something a bit more friendly than the kind of conservation and biodiversity point of view. And certainly, I mean, it's difficult because there are certain, particularly bird species, that do only thrive on open areas, and you don't want to prejudice populations, some of which have significantly dropped, like curlews and so forth, some of the waded species. So you have to be a bit careful. It's all about the right tree in the right place for the right reasons.
Fantastic. So just one last question before we wrap up is from Morag, and I guess this gives us an excuse maybe to outline a little bit more about the organisations that we do have now in action in Scotland and the way that the work is sort of split between them. So she says, as a paid up member of the Woodland Trust, how important is its contribution to the total picture?
Massively, massively. I'm so pleased you asked me this question. Woodland Trust is doing fantastic work in Scotland. Have a look at its budget, because I think most people imagine it spends a very few million a year. I ask my friends and they say, well, it's about 5 to 10 million, isn't it? And I say, no, it's actually north of 50 million a year,
Wow.
60, that it's spending on woodlands. And a large part of that is about acquiring some really exciting places. So Ben Shieldaig in Scotland was one of the ones. And the Arcade Woodlands, which of course got very famous, particularly during lockdown with the ospreys there. And so the Woodland Trust are doing fantastic work. And I think it's looking really exciting in terms of expansion in Scotland. A lot of the woodlands are in England, and that's not surprising, really. You know, they're sort of closer to where people live and so forth. But yes, I think I've lost sight of the original question, but I'm just going on a rant about how great the Woodland Trust is and what wonderful things it's doing in Scotland, and that looks set to be to continue into the future.
Fantastic. Well, that perfectly answered the question. Thank you so much. And it was really enjoyable having that question and answer with you. So thank you. And thank you to all of our audience members who sent in questions as well. In a second, I'm going to hand back to John to say our thanks. But just before I do, could I remind you all that I think usually we ask for a donation for these events. So I'll be putting the link to our PayPal account in the comments, and you'll also get an email about that, and to register for our upcoming events on Eventbrite too. So we hope to see you there. Over to you, John.
And thank you to Carrie and to James. You asked at the beginning, James, what did forestry or the Forestry Commission mean to people? And I must admit, I thought of smell, the faint sort of zing of pine, the sort of aftershave or shower gel sort of connotation, and also noise, the quiet hum of the dreaded Scottish midge and that sort of thing. I was once privileged to write a thesis on forestry and leisure as part of an urban design degree in Edinburgh. And I remember then thinking that it was like studying a great saga, a program that had come out of the Great War and carried on. And that's half a century ago, so it's carried on a lot more since. More recently, I went to a place called Alice Holt. I was very excited. I felt I was going to the origins of British forestry, forestry research and so on. I think the greatest, we're used in the times we live in to greenwash, to headline grabbing politicians talking about abolishing carbon by next year and that kind of thing, which we all know is not probably really going to happen. So I think the story you've told of an agency that keeps on going, of a movement that diverts a little to the left, a little to the right to accommodate political whim, but carries on going, is terribly inspiring. So I hope that forestry can look forward to many more crises and surviving many more of them. And all we need to now to know, James, is could there possibly be a book on this subject?
I'm glad you asked me that, John, because yes, I've written a brief history of the Forestry Commission. I did this for the Royal Scottish Forestry Society, so any proceeds from the sale of this book goes to them. And what we can do is email participants out with a link to how they could get hold of a copy if you'd like to. It's not very much, it's less than £10, I think, but and it's got lots of photographs and things in it. Yes, I sort of commend that to you.
Thank you very much. So thank you, James. Thank you, Carrie. Look forward to seeing everyone next time. And our speaker will be Irene McFarlane on publishing in Scots. Thank you and goodbye just now.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.